Hi, it's Amy Chappell from Amarina Designs, and today I'm here to show you how to make this witch hat mini pillow. This mini pillow is so fun for tier trays, mantels, and anywhere you want to add a little touch of seasonal decor. We're going to begin by cutting out our wool felt pieces for applique. Normally, I like to just use one method for cutting out my applique, whether it's water-soluble transfer paper or freezer paper. But in assembling this pillow, I feel like it's best to combine the two different methods. So we're going to cut out the witch hat and the hat band using your favorite method for cutting out just plain wool felt. I really prefer to use printable freezer paper sheets. You can use regular printer paper and staples, or you can use pattern spray. I have a whole YouTube video showing all of my basic tips and tricks for working with felt applique that walks you through all three of those methods for cutting out felt. Once you have got the pattern traced onto your freezer paper, you're going to cut out a little margin, a slight margin around, and then attach it to your felt. Then you will cut out the pattern piece right on the traced line, and then you can peel it away from your felt, and then you have your piece all ready to go. So you'll do that for both the hat and the band. And then for the background scalloped base here, I recommend using this water-soluble transfer paper. It is the best method that I have found for transferring embroidery patterns onto felt. You can also use tissue paper, but there's some issues with that I haven't quite worked out yet. So my recommendation for this project is this water-soluble transfer paper. You will print out the pattern that's included in your printable pattern onto the water-soluble paper. And then you cut out just, again, a slight margin around the scalloped edge here. And then you want to take your scissors and you're going to cut out this witch hat from inside the pattern piece. You want to make sure that you're only cutting through the outside edge one time to give you a more easy time transferring this pattern onto the felt. And you want to keep this pattern piece to make sure that you have it for the embroidery once we have our witch hat assembled. So you're going to take your felt that you're going to use for your scalloped base, and then you will peel away the paper backing of your water-soluble transfer material. And this is where it's really handy to only have one cut through that. And then you are going to carefully lay it down onto your felt. And you want to make sure that you are keeping it flat and even. I'm going to make sure that this cut right here is all lined up. And then I will push this down onto my felt. Now I will take my scissors and I'm going to cut out right onto this printed line here. And then I will take my cut out felt pieces and I'm going to use this opening in the water-soluble material as a guide to position them. Then I will use a whip stitch and I'm going to stitch down both my hat and the band. And once we get to that point, we'll return and I'll show you the next steps in getting our hat together. Hat stitched down onto the background, and now I'm going to place my hat band. And how I am going to position that is where the sides line up with the sides of the pointy part of the hat. That is where I am going to position my hat band. And then to do the whip stitch, I use a single strand of coordinating floss. And then I just bring up my needle from the back. And then I bring it down perpendicular to the edge of the felt piece that I'm stitching it onto. And I will just continue doing that all the way around. When I get to corners, what I like to do is I will bring my needle down on the felt in the corner in order to tack down that corner a little bit so that it doesn't kind of scooch to one side or the other of that stitch and poke out. The trick with your whip stitch is your goal is to keep your stitches the same length into the felt as well as the same spacing apart from each other. But this is hand stitching at its finest, and we are just going to enjoy the process. So once you've whip stitched down this hat band, then we're going to come back and add our embroidery. Now that the hat band is also stitched down, I am going to go ahead and add my embroidery pattern here. So I am just going to peel away the sticky, the paper backing from my sticky water-soluble transfer paper. And then I am going to just line it up with the edges of my hat and try to keep the hat band lined up as well. And it may be off just a little bit. It's more important that the hat band kind of gets lined up than the witch hat itself does. And this is probably off only because of the positioning of where I have placed my felt band there. So I am just going to line this up mostly with the band and press down here, and you'll still see that these line up okay over here. And now I am ready to add my embroidery stitches. The first one that we're going to do is the woven wheel, and I will show you how to make that flower. And then the rest of the embroidery, we will tuck under, like the edges of our stems and stuff will go underneath that flower. So that's why the first one that we'll do is that big feature flower, that woven wheel flower. To begin our woven wheel flower, we are going to start with full 6 strands of floss. I do not worry about separating these strands for this particular flower, and you'll see why in a minute when we go to do it. But one thing that I do recommend is that you get a needle that is a little bit larger than other embroidery needles. It will help because you are pulling all 12 strands, you know, you've doubled over your 6 strands here. It will help it pull through the felt a little bit easier. So to begin, you're going to come up through the center of your circle here. You'll notice that on the actual pattern itself, it does have this marked. This is just an older version of the pattern that I've printed off and am using. Then you are going to bring your needle down, and we are going to section off. And you may need to wiggle it a little bit to get these because it's such thick floss all the way through. So we are going to add 5 spokes to our wagon wheel here, which is why it gets the name of the woven wheel. So we're going to come up and back down through this center here. And because I have my knot there, I'm just going to scooch that out of the way from underneath. And you are going to add 5 spokes. Once you have all of your spokes in place, you are going to bring your needle up right next to one of the spokes towards the center, as close to the center as you can get it. So you can see I'm going to bring it up right here. The final step for this is the most time-consuming, but also the coolest part. You're basically just going to weave your floss over and under the different spokes. So this first one I'm going to go over, and this second one I will come under. And you want to make sure you're going under all 6 strands of floss. You're going to pull that through. I'll go over this one, under this next one. And then you'll just continue that process, weaving it over and under all the way around until your floss covers this outer circle of your flower, marking the position where it needs to be. It gets full, you may notice that some of your spokes are less visible than other spokes. And so as you keep going around, you will be able to kind of look underneath there and see it. And you can go ahead and just slide it under where that spoke goes down to continue wrapping on the outside of things to make sure that you get all of these, the length of all of your spokes covered with your floss. So we're just going to kind of go underneath where we know that spoke is, even though we can't really see it, and keep going a couple more times until those spokes are all the way covered. Now that we have all of the spokes pretty well covered, I'm going to take my needle and I'm just going to push it through the felt towards the back, just so that it's underneath the edges of my flower there. That way you can't really see the end of my stitching. And then I will just tie a knot in the back and finish it off. So if you've never seen someone finish a knot, this is how I do it. I run my stitch under a stitch, make a loop, and run my needle through and tighten it. I will repeat that so that it's a double knot. And then the last thing that I will do, especially when I'm working on felt, is I will bury my floss into the felt. So now I am going between the layers of black and white felt here. And I'm just going to pull it through so that there's a tail that's kind of tucked in between those two layers. And then I will trim it right up next to the felt. And that way I just have a little extra leverage there so that this knot won't come undone and my stitches will stay in place where I want them. And that is how you stitch a woven wheel. That we're going to do is called the fishbone stitch. It's the stitch we use to make these large bright green leaves underneath our woven wheel flower. We're going to use 3 strands of floss that have been separated from each other. And I am just going to add a knot to the bottom of my thread. I'm going to bring my needle up at the top point of my leaf, right where that center dividing line is. Then I'm going to bring my needle down about halfway along that center line. And that is just going to give me my guide for my stitches as I start this process. The next stitch will come up right next to, on either side, one side or the other of that center stitch. You can see my needle coming up right there. And then it is going to come down, crossing over this center stitch. Then my needle is going to come up on the opposite side from where I just started. And then I am going to cross over the bottom of that stitch I just did. Now I am going to alternate back and forth. So coming up next to the first stitch I did to the side of my center, again crossing over the bottom of that stitch. And then the other side. You can see as I continue my stitches that it then creates this woven pattern down the center of my leaf, giving it that interest that makes this such a fun stitch. So again, just keep going until you have filled that entire leaf with your fishbone stitch, and then you'll repeat it for the other 2 large leaves. When I get up to where my leaf is butting up next to my flower here, and I no longer have room to cross my stitches over, I will just fill in these last little corners with a satin stitch to round out my leaf. And that is how you stitch a fishbone leaf. The remaining flowers in this pattern are all stitches that I've already shown. There are French knot little flowers here. These 3 petal flowers use lazy daisy stitches, and then the fern leaves also use lazy daisies and a back stitch for the stem. You will follow all of the instructions in the stitching guide here, talking about the number of strands of floss to use and the stitches to use. If you don't remember either the French knot or the lazy daisy stitch, I do have separate videos for those on my YouTube channel. So you will go ahead and finish up all of the rest of your leaves and flowers, and then you will take your felt, your scalloped background, you will center it onto the piece of fabric you will be using for your mini pillow front, and then you will center it in place, and again, following the stitching guide, stitch down around the edges using your French knots. Then you will soak this in cool water to make sure that you are not going to shrink your felt at all. Use cool water and soak it until all of your soluble material dissolves. Then you will set it aside and allow it to dry. Do not press on your stitches with a towel or anything, even though it seems tempting to do it to get it to dry quicker. It's best if you just leave it alone, lay it flat. I place mine on a nice fluffy towel. The towel will wick away the water, and you'll just let it sit for a good, probably full day until it's all the way dry, and then you'll come back and we'll box out the corners and finish up our mini pillow. Assembling our mini pillow, we are going to begin by taking our 2 squares and placing them right sides together. Because I haven't finished stitching the sample I've been working on in this video, I have switched fabrics here and also to allow the stitching lines to show up a little better. So one of your sides will have your applique and embroidery on it, and the other side will be plain. You will place them right sides together, and you will sew around all 4 sides using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure to back stitch at the beginning and the ending of your sewing, and leave an opening of about 2–2.5 inches for turning at the end. You want to make sure that your stitching does not travel any closer than maybe an inch away from the edges, to make sure that as we go to box these corners, we don't accidentally cut apart this seam here. Once they are sewn together, the next thing you will do is to take a ruler and a pen, and you're going to mark 1/2 inch squares at each of the 4 corners. I just line up my ruler here, and then I will mark all 4 of those corners. Once they're all marked, you're going to take a pair of scissors and you will cut out each of the 4 corners. Now it's time to box our corners. You'll start at one of the corners, it doesn't matter which one, but you'll begin by pulling apart the 2 pieces of fabric at the corner of that square you just cut out. So you will bring those 2 corners out, and it will create a straight line with that cut edge. Next, you're going to take your 2 seam allowances here, and you're just going to push them in opposite directions. It doesn't matter which direction, which side goes which way. You just want them to go opposite directions, and it will cause that seam to nest together, and they will fit really nicely. So you'll have a straight line across the top and your 2 seam allowances going in opposite directions. I will put a pin in right through those seam allowances there to hold that straight line in place. And then I will go around and repeat for all of my corners. So again, I'm going to pull it out at the cut corner to make my straight line across. When I go to do the second corner, I will follow this seam allowance here and have it continue the same direction, and then push the other seam allowance in the opposite direction. It just allows this side seam to stay nice and flat on your finished pillow where if it twisted the seam allowance there, it may create a little bit of a wave. So again, make sure that my line is straight across, my seam allowances are going opposite and they're nesting with one another, and continue around with all of my 4 corners. The final step in boxing your corners is to take it to your sewing machine and sew across each of these corners using a 1/4 inch seam allowance from that raw edge, and backstitch at the beginning and ending of all of your stitching. Once you've done that for all 4 corners, then you're ready to turn your mini pillow right side out. Now this same boxing technique you can use on zipper pouches and tote bags and all different sorts of things. I love adding dimension to things using boxed corners. So now I am going to each of my corners, and I want to make sure that I have pressed out that entire seam all the way out so that I have nice crisp corners. Sometimes I will even roll that seam allowance between my fingers to kind of finger press each corner to make sure that it is nice and even and as flat as I can get it. And then once that's finished, then I'm going to stuff this with some fiberfill or other stuffing material that you like to use. And then you can stitch the bottom closed. You can either use a ladder stitch or a whip stitch, whichever works for you. I do have a video tutorial showing the ladder stitch if that's what you prefer. Or again, you can just whip stitch it, just running a stitch around that edge. Just use a thread that is the same color as your fabric, and those stitches will just disappear. So that is how you make a mini pillow, perfect for tiered trays, for dough bowls, for mantels, anywhere you want to add just a little bit of seasonal decor. If you've enjoyed this video, I would love to have you subscribe to my channel. You can find the pattern for this witch hat mini pillow again in my Etsy shop, along with lots of other felt applique patterns, different mini pillow patterns, and other seasonal and fun home decor projects that are quick and fun and easy to sew. Until I see you next time, happy stitching, everyone.